Hello friends, welcome to the third session of our video lecture series on Environmental Management System. In the previous two lectures, we have been discussing the relevance and importance of an environmental management system in the wake of the environmental pollution and degradation that has happened over the years of Industrial Revolution and the quality of life that we are all enjoying today. We have also discussed the ISO 14001, which has the basic roots of how to establish an environmental management system. As discussed, the system is based on interrelated processes which should all be documented and should always lead to continual improvement happening at all stages of the system. The 5 elements which are basic to any management system also apply to an environmental management system, which is the PDCA cycle, and it is addressed in 14001 in the form of 5 major elements: environmental policy, planning, implementation and operation, checking and corrective action, and last but not the least, management review. In our second series, we had discussed in detail how to implement an environmental policy, how to formulate it, how to go about the planning, and the last discussed in series 2 was implementation and operation. As was discussed, just a quick review, the policy has to be appropriate to the nature of the work of the organization. It has to be documented, implemented, maintained, and communicated to all the people involved in the system. The planning part mainly consists of identifying the activities that are of the organization and then identifying what are the impacts, environmental impacts from those activities, and out of that signifying what are the major ones which are causing significant impact. And at the same time, we should be cognizant of all the legal and other requirements applicable to the operation of the organization. It then leads to establishing the objectives and targets related to environmental management of the activities of the organization. And in the last, the implementation and operation involves developing a proper management program which has all the things implemented. Coming now to the fourth process, which is the implementation and operation. The fourth process is the organization and accountability, which involves jotting out all the structure of all the people involved, what will be the flow of responsibility and authority among the people. Next is to develop capabilities and competencies among them to carry out the required task of the management system through trainings, through awareness programs, and there should be proper channel of communications, which should also at the same time be a two-way communication. And next is exercising controls, that is through documentation, developing proper documentation so that everything is process driven and not person driven, having documentation control so that the documentation is controlled at all times. It is valid documents which are used, all the up-to-date documents that are used, and the documents that are issued by the competent authority, those are used. Next is again then operating or having all the operational control on all the activities of the system, and last but not the least, having an emergency preparedness and response ready for the people of the system. Today we will discuss in detail the checking and corrective action part of the ISO 14001 cycle, which is also part of PDCA cycle. So this is the C, which is the check part, checking and corrective action. If we try to look at it in the term of a flow chart, the first process involves what we are monitoring. We are monitoring the system that has been planned, that was implemented. Now we have to monitor it, how it's going. And when we are monitoring, we have to measure it in terms of tangible numbers or some baselines that are established, how to measure it. Arising from that, we might find that there are some places where we are not conforming to what we had planned. It is not going as per that. So there might be some non-conforming areas that might get identified during this process. So some corrective action has to be taken to correct that at the same time, and at the same time we should also be looking at a preventive action so that it doesn't recur again. So all this can be achieved through periodic and regular internal audits which are related to this environmental management system, and at the same time proper records have to be maintained for all these activities, which again will be a useful tool for the continual improvement cycle. Let's discuss this in detail. Now looking at the monitoring and measurement part, it basically addresses how is the organization evaluating the key characteristics of the system established with respect to conformance to both the environmental objectives and targets that was set by the organization, as well as the laws and regulations applicable to the organization. The performance has to be formally tracked, and there has to be an operational control there. All the objectives and targets should always be reflected while preparing all such baselines and measurement systems. Necessary for this would, of course, then if we are trying to monitor how our environmental performance is, there might be some equipments that might be required to measure, to measure all these types of parameters. So they have to be there. Proper equipment should be available, and it should be up to date and calibrated in time so that we are assured that it is giving us correct results. So again, for this type of monitoring and measurement, the system should be a one that is well established and documented, again stressing on the documentation part. So there should be a set system for that, and the frequency of activities should be pre-decided, and they all have to be again related to the significant impacts that we had identified in our step of planning. An organization next has to ensure that all the devices that are being used to monitor and measure, they are accurately calibrated to ensure they're giving correct results. The organization has to have a set frequency for all these kinds of checks that they are applying from time to time. Again, all those targets and significant impacts that were identified, they have led to what we had established as our established targets. So all our measurements, all our corrective actions, they are directly to be linked to be all be moving around this significant impact activities. A document procedure, set frequency has to be there. Now, when we are trying to monitor ourselves, we have come across some non-conformances. So basically the next part of this is on non-conformance and corrective and preventive action, which basically discusses how the organization is handling the non-conformance that has arisen with respect to the environmental management system established by the organization. So again, any non-conformance, very commonly also called as an NC. So there has to be it has to be established who has the responsibility as well as the authority to mitigate the impacts of this non-conformance. In case some non-conformance occurs, there would be, of course, significant impacts because of it. So who has the authority and responsibility to mitigate such impacts quickly? Then again, once the impact has been mitigated, the problem has been tackled on ground, but the main idea is we have to go back to what caused it. So there must be a detailed root cause analysis that should follow to see what happened. So a cause has to be identified, and the problem then needs to be properly tackled at the cause stage where the cause was lying. Even that has to be mitigated so that the problem is handled in a correct way. So it is not just about having a correction, it is about having a corrective action. Let's explain this with an example. Say there was a fire outbreak which was not actually supposed to happen, but it happened. An emergency happened. There was a fire outbreak, and people were trained. People had already been trained as a part of an environmental management system emergency response. They were trained how to use it. People were defined how to use it, and who would be designated to actually use the fire extinguishers that were installed in the organization. But what happened at the time of this outbreak was that the fire extinguisher did not work properly, and the fire could not be mitigated, leading to a loss of property and life. So now a correction here can be to see that the fire extinguisher was not working well, so it is replaced. So that has been taken care of. Now it is a correction that has been done, so this has been taken care of. But actually we have to go deep into the problem. What we should see is, if the fire extinguisher was not in a working condition, why was it not actually seen by the people responsible for it? Why was it not in their notice that a fire extinguisher which is not in a working condition is installed there? So we need to go deep into this. Who was assigned the responsibility to have proper frequency checks on the system, whether they are working or not? So all this has to be, then we have to go into a corrective action wherein we go deep into who was responsible for checking this fire extinguisher. Why was it not checked such that when it was actually required it could not work? So corrective action would be to see, maybe it might happen the person might say I was overloaded with other kind of works, or he did not have the correct he might not be getting the financial support him, he wanted to maybe replace the fire extinguisher. So corrective action has to be to see why this has happened. So again, tackling it that problem. So to see now the resources are coming to him in rightly timely fashion, and also the workload should be properly distributed so that this doesn't happen. So this is what will count to be a proper corrective action for such a non-conformance that had arisen. So moving forward, if we talk of how to address a non-conformance, the next part is to whatever procedures have to be modified so that this doesn't occur again. As I said, there might be a procedure might be changed to see how the workload is divided. So they might change their procedure. There might be a procedure change so that the resources are well available. So it might lead to the procedures that have been established. They might have to be changed. Now, a very important part of all this non-conformance is that it should be documented. It might be a tendency that we might say, oh, we should not document it so that people don't know that such a kind of flaw happened at our organization, but actually no, it should be properly documented so that it can serve as a purpose for the audit that we were looking at, and also as a source for a continual improvement strategy for us. Again, whatever non-conformance comes, that has to be properly notified and it has to be mitigated. The cause has to be investigated and its recurrence has to be prevented by all means. As a preventive measure, we might modify some existing procedures. And the change procedure, again, as we talked of communication, which is a very important part of implementation. So there has to be communication about the change procedure so that the people involved in it can actually use the change procedure there. Now let us discuss how do we actually come to know that a non-conformance has come. There can be a non-conformance, as the example we gave, that happened by itself. There can be other kinds of non-conformance. The system might not being followed. Some documentation may not be happening as planned. So they can, let's see where where all these non-conformances originate. Mostly, if we are doing a regular internal reporting system of our environmental management system, we would come to know, as was also in the case of fire extinguisher that we discussed. Had they been reporting it regularly, they would have come to know that the fire extinguisher was not in a working condition. Sometimes the organization suppliers or other stakeholders, they also might tell them from their feedback that something non-conforming is happening. So that is a very good point for the organization to be very vigilant about external communications. They should always be welcoming positive as well as negative feedback from their stakeholders so that it can serve as an opportunity to identify any non-conformance that might arise. Again, as said, our users and stakeholders can also be a good source of telling us that a non-conformance is happening. Okay. Now again, as I said, a very important part of it, records have to be maintained. Records that actually help us in having an audit trail that can be established through records, and also it will serve in planning for other systems when the organization takes up, and also for improvement. So this part of the environmental management system 14001 actually handles that how the organization is handling the records which are associated with the environmental management system. So all these records, they have to be identifiable. If I say this is my environmental policy, it should be identifiable that this is the environmental policy for, say, organization A, issued by this person on this date, and it is this issue number. It was reviewed by this, approved by this, and how it will be, and issued to whom. It might be issued to some very important people. So there are only few people who really need to have a copy of it. So issued to whom. So all these kind of details have to be there. Again, as we had talked about obsolete documents, sometimes documents, they get obsolete. So it should be marked properly obsolete. So they have to be identifiable. Again, their storage should be very proper. If the documents are not stored properly and they end up being deteriorated, so that actually defeats the purpose of having the documentation at the first place. Again, document has to be protected from any unauthorized usage. It should be retrievable. Say I'm on an audit, my auditor is asking for a file, but I'm not able to fetch it for the next 1 hour. So there is no use of such documentation. So it should be retrievable whenever and wherever and whomsoever requires it. Again, all the records, as we say, they might not be required to be kept forever. They might be retained for a particular amount of time, and how they are disposed is also important. It might be some important information. So how they are disposed, who has the responsibility to dispose it, all these things have to be all actually identified with when we are dealing with the records clause of the ISO 14001. Now again, the records, to be useful for the system to work, they must be legible. Okay, I should be able to read it. They should be identifiable and traceable to the activity. So if there is a record related to an EMS audit, so the record should clearly identify that this is a document for the audit. It should be related to the activity, product or service involved. Again, the records, the way they are kept, so they are basically based on the procedures that the organization has developed based on the ISO 14001, and based on those procedures to actually implement those procedures, these records get generated. So they should all, of course, show that we are conforming to the standard. Again, the retention system, there should be a proper record retention system within the organization, how it will be retained. And again, the time frames have to be actually set by the organization, which kind of document will be retained for what amount of time. So some of the important documents that the organization might want to retain are related to legal and some other statutory requirements if they are there. All the permits that the organization might have taken, those are important documents to be retained. All the environmental aspects and impacts that have been identified by the organization while implementing the system, all these kind of records should be maintained. What was the training provided to all the people of the organization related to the system? All the inspection and calibration information of the measuring equipment, any monitoring data that we are taking, like a company might be monitoring the carbon dioxide levels in its factory. So this becomes an important record that we are monitoring how much we have set a target that the carbon dioxide levels would be decreased by say 10% over this year. So they have to properly monitor. They are monitoring it, so they'll be putting in records. Today it was recorded at 10 a.m. This is the amount of carbon dioxide. At 2 p.m. So this becomes proper record, and the actually equipment which is measuring this carbon dioxide, it should be properly calibrated. So calibration certificate should be kept in record. Other types of records which are useful to retain, all the non-conformance reports that are there, and all the follow-up information, that is all the corrective and preventive action that the organization had taken thereof. All the audits, all the audit reports and everything, all those should be there. The management reviews that we had discussed earlier, in short, that is the fifth element of 14001. And all the emergency preparedness response information. If we are doing drills and all those things, how are we actually preparing ourselves? So it should all, we said everything has to be documented. So records will of course get generated, so they must be retained. Now, there might be a question in all our minds. I mean, how to decide what is the retention time? I might keep it for a year, for a 2 year, something might be good for 6 months. So actually, there are different types of documents. They require different kind of retention times, and it will also depend, it will vary from organization to organization, and also within that organization, within that system, different type of record will have different type of retention time. So say we are talking of permits. So they are established by regulatory groups. They might say they might say that you need a permit for which is valid for 5 years. So of course you will be actually retaining that document for 5 years. There is no use throwing it. And in fact, sometimes such type of documents are not even thrown. They might be archived and kept for record purposes in case something might arise later on. So many times records are not disposed also. They're sometimes retained also, but they are taken out of the system as not required. They might be archived. Okay. Now again, if there are some records which are related to non-conformances that have arisen, so they might be kept for a longer time so that they can be reviewed over and see that the non-conformance doesn't arise again. Okay. So again, these audits and management review records, they are very important and they have to be retained properly. Now let's talk about the audit part, which was the last element of the checking, corrective action, preventive action. So an EMS audit, as it is called, Environmental Management System Audit. So a proper program on how, when will it be done, and a procedure, how it will be done, and it has to be periodic. It has to be a periodic, the interval has to be set by the organization beforehand. So that has to be established by the organization. Again, we have to see that whatever procedure was made, it is properly implemented, maintained. The audit has to be as per conforming with the requirements of 14001. And again, the audit information, whatever arises out of the audit, all our non-conformances or all our good points, they have to be put forward to the top management for their review, which is again the next part of this cycle. So this basically addresses how does the organization conduct its audits So again, the procedures, they must define the method of the audit, how will the audit will be conducted in detail, what will be the qualification of auditors. Again, we all can very much comprehend that auditors, they should be the people who are independent of the activity being audited, so that there is no bias that comes in. It is a requirement that audit reports are submitted to the top management. Again, audit reports at the same time, when they are pointing out all the non-conformances, they sometimes also contain recommendations on how to correct and how the non-conformance can be discovered if it happens in futures. If I talk of a frequency, when we, again, like a question might arise, how often to do an audit? So if a system is mature enough, it has been running for a long time, maybe once a year is a good interval, but again, there is no hard and fast rule on that. So the organization can do how it plans is the best suited for their system. Again, if the system is in, say, in an implementation phase, so they might want to do it more frequently, maybe to wait for a year to see that how much we have failed is not a good idea. So more frequent might be required, and a place where non-conformance has occurred. Say the non-conformance occurred in the records department, they couldn't maintain the records. So there you might want to do an audit more frequently to see, to keep them in check, to see that, okay, if we did the corrective action now, how they are doing now. So there might be more follow-up audits that might happen in such areas where non-conformances are there. So there the frequency would be more definitely. So that finishes our discussion on the checking and corrective action part. Now coming to the last element of the 14,001, which is called the management review. As we all discussed before also, for a system to run, we have to give the people proper authority as well as the resources. So resources is something which comes from the top management, and also which we had discussed in the first element, which was the policy. So the policy, it was very well mentioned that the policy, the commitment has to come from the top management. So that is why keeping management in the loop to tell them what is happening on the system is very important, which is why this is a full-fledged separate section as a part of 14,001, a management review. So basically, let's see, this management review, it has to take account of all the audit findings, whatever was found in the EMS audit discussed. Then what are the progress records with regard to any objectives, any change in facilities that are required, any change in activities might be required because of market competition or something like that, new equipment might have to be purchased. So all these things, any change in technology that might has happened, any concerns of any of your stakeholders, interested parties, any relevant information that the management needs to know which is related to the system has to be discussed in such reviews. Basically, all these things are reviewed to see how is the suitability, adequacy and effectiveness of the system in place. Okay, and in order to do that, there might be in such kind of reviews, what mostly happens, they might be, because of all these concerns arising, they might be changing the environmental policy, there might be a change in the objectives and targets, or the other elements of EMS might be changed as well during such reviews to actually keep on establishing that the system is adequate, it is suitable and effective even till date. Okay, so again, this review has to be at planned intervals, just like audit was to be at a planned intervals. It has to be at a planned interval, and mostly the most suitable time is after the audit to conduct a management review. But again, there is no hard and fast rule on that. So again, as I said, the review has to be done on what is the environmental policy, what are the objectives, then all the EMS processes, how the performance data is coming out. We are of course monitoring and measuring how the system is happening, so that has to be reviewed in this meeting. Then this again gives rise to opportunities for improvement and any need for changes. Again, for a management review, again, as we said, a person should be designated who will be actually the link between the top management and the people who are executing the EMS. So it is the responsibility of that person to ensure that all the necessary information is provided to the management to conduct such review. This review again has to be documented. Whatever is done in the review, it should be documented. And it should, of course, the review has to address what are the possible need for changes, so that thereafter it can be taken up by the system people involved in case they need to change some procedures or records. So that has to be properly documented and identified in such review meetings. So type of material to be provided to the top management, all the compliance information, say we have been monitoring the records, Those can go internal audit reports, then progress, which we are monitoring with respect to the environmental targets, information with respect to environmental aspects, and any internal or external communication other than these not covered. If not covered, that if it is related to the management system, that also must be shared with the management at this time, because top management is the one that drives the continual improvement. So, summing up the environmental management system. So, the first element is, of course, the policy. So, company has, wherein the company is saying what it is going to do for environmental protection. Next part is the planning, which says what to do and how to do it. The third part, implementation, says how to set it up so that it can be done. Check says make sure that it is done the right way, and review helps us in ensuring that whenever a change is required, it is done. So, we will sum up this discussion today, again looking at the elements of the PDCA cycle of 14001, which involve policy, planning, implementation and operation, checking and corrective action, and management review, which should always all be linked to the continual improvement. In our last series, part 4, in our last lecture, part 4 of this series, we will be now discussing about how to actually implement this system for the organization. Thank you.